On July 3, 2025, the Colombian Navy made a stunning announcement that shook global intelligence. They had intercepted the world's first unmanned, remote-controlled submarine. This wasn't a research vessel. It was an advanced craft designed purely for smuggling illegal substances. The revelation sent shockwaves through the global media. Where had this sophisticated vessel originated? And more importantly, who was the mastermind behind its operation? To this day, those questions remain unanswered, but the subsequent investigation uncovered some chilling truths. First, the submarine was equipped with a satellite dish connected to the Starlink network, allowing it to be navigated remotely across vast distances. This was a technological breakthrough, but also a massive security breach. Starlink receivers are not supposed to operate without official authorization. So how did a criminal organization manage to activate one? Did they have someone on the inside? A leak within Starlink? Or was it something even more dangerous? Second, investigators discovered the submarine wasn't actually carrying drugs or weapons. It was loaded only with bags of sand. This was a test run, checking if the route was safe before sending real cargo. But the third discovery was perhaps the most unsettling of all. This wasn't an isolated incident. In fact, this vessel was one of at least 14 similar stealth submarines uncovered so far. The estimated volume of smuggled contraband? Over 25 tons. And if you're thinking this is just unusually creative smuggling, think again. The mastermind behind these vessels didn't just build crude subs. They engineered stealth submarines, vessels undetectable even by the most advanced radar systems. As we've already seen, this is no ordinary smuggling story. The facts feel almost extraterrestrial. Today I'll tell you about what is now considered the largest smuggling operation in human history. What's stranger? The high-tech route, the stealth submarines that carried the cargo, the sheer tonnage, the master plan, how the gang distributed loads inside the subs, or the price paid for the shipment. Even the ending of this tale is weirder than everything that came before. To understand the full scope, we must first look at one of the planet's oldest and worst crimes: the trade in weapons, people, and contraband. For decades, governments have pursued the same goal: to shut down the three most dangerous illegal trades on Earth. The narcotics market, in particular, has several international hubs whose job is simple and brutal: grow, manufacture, and sell to the world. Afghanistan used to top that list. At one point, the country was responsible for roughly 85% of the world's supply of certain banned substances. Growing poppy there was as common as growing tomatoes. Then, after Afghanistan fell under the Taliban, a violent crackdown began. The result? A supplier that once accounted for 85% of the global market went from overflowing fields to virtually zero exports, wiped out almost overnight. Syria, too, once had a flourishing illicit industry. Before the war, sophisticated networks supplied the region. After the country's liberation and the collapse of those systems, that industry also ground to a halt. Building on that collapse of the old supply hubs, the scene of the new market becomes painfully clear. Today, the largest suppliers in the world are Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, and add Colombia to that list. Notice the pattern? Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia are all in the Americas, and together they have become the planet's biggest producers. So, how do these massive shipments move? It depends entirely on the destination. Cargo bound for the United States usually travels by sea across the Atlantic or along coastal routes, while shipments for Europe are often flown by air. The most notorious maritime method is the old-school Caribbean pirate route. Aging ships with reckless crews taking on contraband. If coast guards or naval vessels intercept them, it's not always a simple firefight. These smugglers have a brutal, effective, and devastating tactic. They take hostages. They don't kidnap one or two people. They bring dozens, 50, perhaps more, and keep them alive and visible on deck. If a Navy ship or Coast Guard contemplates an attack, the smuggler's message is blunt. We have hostages. Don't come close. Everything is recorded, often broadcast live. Because if the authorities strike and civilians die, the incident instantly becomes a global scandal. That public risk is often enough to deter even the most determined enforcement actions. Air smuggling presents a different headache. Airport security is famously strict. You've seen the documentaries showing how invasive the checks are. Even a toothbrush can trigger a search. That makes air smuggling risky, but the criminal determination is relentless. Smugglers use an astonishing array of routes. Overland by cars, trains, even horse carts. Hidden paths carved through wildlife corridors, small drones and massive catapults to fling packages across borders. And yes, even trained raptors at sea. In other words, the options are limitless, by land, sea, and air. And in the US, the problem is especially acute because the criminal networks are pervasive, often outnumbering ordinary citizens in certain border regions. Linking back to how determined and inventive these networks are, the truth is both simple and terrifying. Smuggling into the United States is surprisingly easy because there are so many avenues of attack. Often, the preferred route remains by sea. A small, remotely controlled vessel slips out of one of the production countries and drifts onto an American shore at night. Sometimes, it carries only 10 kilos, small, tidy loads that still get through. There are even specialized divers who swim contraband across borders. This cat-and-mouse game between cartels and governments has been ongoing for decades. The cost of chasing this industry is staggering. Roughly $2 trillion every year worldwide, and that's just the enforcement side. That figure doesn't even account for the social damage. Ruined generations, crippled economies, environmental harm, and destroyed agriculture. Innovation in smuggling never sleeps. Smugglers hide drugs inside tomatoes and watermelons, electrical wiring, inside children's toys, and even sewn into sheep. Whatever it takes to get a shipment past the border. And when one route is exposed, they invent another. Every hour demands a new plan. I told you all that so you'd understand the landscape of this filthy trade and how hard it is to break. That's why the hero, or rather, the villain of our story, couldn't be just some genius tinkering in a garage. He needed a plan that would shatter every expectation. In 2021, the undisputed kingpin of Colombia's narcotics trade, still unnamed to this day, made a shocking decision. He announced he would shut down the business entirely. People in his position don't leave quietly. Their exits are always dramatic, surrenders, suicides, or engineered handovers to Interpol that solidify their legend. But this man didn't want a quiet retirement. He wanted the biggest retirement shipment in history, 15 tons. To put that in perspective, typical smuggling loads are measured in hundreds of kilos. A 100-kilo shipment is common. Nobody had ever attempted to move 1,000 kilos, 1 ton at once. The world's markets would be instantly flooded. So his plan to move 15 tons was not just insane, it was unprecedented. He set to work on a plan. Dozens of ideas were floated. but everyone came to the same conclusion. A shipment of that size could only travel by submarine. If you have billions, the first thought is to buy a military-grade submarine. Which country builds the best? America, Russia, North Korea? Surely money overcomes politics. What's the price tag? $1 billion, maybe. Our man says, fine, here are $2 billion. And the plot lines up for something unprecedented. But buying one? Impossible, even if you owned every cent on Earth. Listen, you could buy the White House and the Kremlin, turn them into car washes, and open a cigarette stand inside. And that would still be easier than simply ordering a submarine off the shelf. That's why a trafficker who truly wants a sub has only one realistic option: build it himself. Our boss, the unnamed Colombian godfather of the trade, didn't mess around. He didn't just hire someone, he kidnapped an entire team. 12 top engineers and a crew of technicians were taken from across the country. Mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, mechatronics specialists, welders, maintenance techs. A full spectrum of skills. They were transported to a secret construction site hidden deep in one of Colombia's forests, organized into working teams, and given a single leader for the project. The terms were obscene. Each team member was promised a windfall if the experiment succeeded, $100 million apiece. That sum was so enormous that a single lifetime couldn't hope to spend it all. The order was clear: succeed or die trying. After a month of planning, the head engineer insisted the only viable approach wasn't building a military sub from scratch, which is impossible, but converting old, existing vessels into functional submersibles. The leader demanded 8 prototypes so they could test different designs. The plan was simple: load them with sand and send them out into the ocean. If they reached the shore, the design passed. If not, they would iterate until it did. 6 months later, the experiment had worked. The submarines were real. Now for the details. The prototype was ironically named Escobar. It measured 15 meters long and was painted a muted blue-gray. Its layout was brutally efficient. The rear compartment housed the engine and was just 2 meters long. The middle section, 6 meters, accommodated the gang members, and the forward section, the largest, was the cargo hold, calibrated to carry exactly 8 tons of contraband, not a gram more or less. That precision had a reason. These vessels were meant to ride semi-submerged, with only a small portion above water to supply air to the men inside. The engineering calculations were meticulous. They accounted for sea salinity, precise weight distribution, and propulsion so that only one device had to operate inside, the engine. Minimal equipment, minimal signature. Later, you'll see why that single constraint mattered so much. Because this is a 15-meter submarine, every detail mattered, even radar reflections and noise. They couldn't risk any electronic signature, so they stripped the vessel of everything that could emit signals. No ventilation systems, no filtration, no pumps for ballast or bilge. Nothing. The sub was as simple as a water bottle. To further cut radar return, they coated the hull with a rubberized plastic that absorbed radar waves. But won't the engine give them away, you might ask? Sound travels and sonar can pick it up. They solved that with a single, brutal idea: a shot launch. The engine was mounted to fire a single, violent burst, aimed precisely at the destination. They would start the engine once, with enormous force. It would run for only 5 minutes, then shut off. After that, the vessel coasted on a single, preset trajectory, charging forward like a bullet. Because the engineers had balanced weight, buoyancy, and trim so exactly, the craft would reach its mark without any further propulsion and with almost no detectable signature. Remember, this was the very first and simplest prototype. The second model, called Chile, was basically the same concept, but stretched to 20 meters and fitted with a fuel tank. Intended for the longer Atlantic run toward Europe, where the engine might need to restart for a return trip. The third design, Diver, could submerge fully. It had an automatic ballast section and a small air intake system with cameras and sensors to chart its path. If radars or surveillance were nearby, the intake could be turned off, and the vessel could surface slightly to take in air and ventilate, allowing the crew safer, longer endurance. Diver was almost luxurious, built to sustain life for up to 2 months at sea. The fourth model ran entirely on battery power. It had a single, extremely powerful motor, fed by roughly 200 massive batteries. Its performance was astonishing, but the range was tiny, about 70 kilometers. How to send a battery sub all the way to Europe? They asked. The workaround was clever and cruelly simple. Tow it. Each sub had a long tether that could be lashed to a mothership. The mothership would tow the craft until it neared the target shore, then cut it loose. If authorities intercepted the towing vessel, the crew could simply release the line. The tugging ship would distract the police, while the unmanned or minimally crewed sub continued on its course. After the coast was clear, the smugglers could return to retrieve the sub. In less than 6 months, these teams had effectively hacked the planet with just 4 designs, converted wrecks patched, welded, and fitted with bespoke propulsion and geometry, so they left almost no radar or acoustic trace. We originally planned 8 prototypes, but 4 were enough to change the calculus of smuggling forever. The boss didn't stop at 4 prototypes. He ultimately demanded 15. By 2022, the merchandise had been prepared for every continent, and the operation moved from prototypes into full production. But before we get to the execution, you need to understand how deeply he'd built his world. This man didn't only create a private NASA and a fleet of stealth submarines. He had his footing inside the police, too. His spies were everywhere. The plan for the 15-ton retirement shipment bound for the United States was diabolical and surgical. They staged a chilling law and order theater. 20 police cars would be waiting where the cargo was due to land. But 18 of those cars were fake. They were gang members dressed as officers, ready to perform a highly public, staged arrest. When the real raid happened, the staged cars would swoop in and pretend to seize the smugglers and their contraband, load them into the vehicles, and drive off toward the police station. In reality, most of those cars would peel away to a completely different location. What looked like a public arrest was a sophisticated con. The fake cops might take half a ton as proof in public spectacle, but the other 14.5 tons would keep moving toward their real destination. Word reached U.S. intelligence. This would be the greatest smuggling operation ever attempted, and its goal was to fundamentally change the market. When something of that scale is planned, every intelligence service springs to life. Imagine 33 countries joining the hunt. No outsider knew exactly how the plan would unfold. Only the boss and his inner lab team in the jungle knew the full design. There were 2 critical arms to this conspiracy. Wing 1 was the head of the submarine engineering team and his crew. Wing 2 was the chief of the fake police unit, the man who would run the on-the-ground ruse once the shipment reached American shores. Between them, they controlled both the delivery vehicle and the illusion of law enforcement that would smuggle it in plain sight. Not a single intelligence service knew a thing. No one knew the launch schedule. No one knew the destinations. It was that secret and that tightly choreographed. That brings us to the day of execution. On June 13, 2022, the subs slipped out, and each caravan set its course, some for Europe, some for the Americas, and a few even bound for China. About 6 hours after launch, the boss called his fake police chief and said, "They're headed for your patch, Miami." That's when the real drama began. Remember, the boss already had half the shipment in cash and billions on hand. Then, the world reacted. Without warning, 5 submarines bound for Europe were intercepted before they could pass through the Strait of Gibraltar. The ones aimed at China were suddenly descended upon from all directions. Arrests, seizures, everything gone. It looked like half the fleet had been neutralized. The boss announced the obvious. It's over. 10 subs are down, meaning about 50% of his cargo was gone. With enemies and debts of that magnitude, there was nowhere safe to hide. So disappearing was his only option. But here's the twist. The shipment destined for the United States sailed through untouched. No interception. The consignment made landfall on Miami's shores, and the local crew recovered it, but not for the boss. In the staged play, the fake police chief took full control of the operation. He used the 20 cars and the sham arrests we already discussed to divert the load to a secondary location. Claiming the original landing zone was being watched, he told the boss not to worry, that everything was under control. Then the situation exploded. At the secondary site, Point W, actual law enforcement raided and arrested everyone present, 30 suspects in custody. But the fake chief had planned one final layer of betrayal. After the arrests, while those men were lined against a wall, he unleashed his own private crew to eliminate them, then killed those new accomplices too, grabbed the entire shipment, all 15 tons, and escaped with it to Cuba. It was a multi-tiered con. The man who had tipped off authorities about the ocean-bound shipments had engineered the spectacle so that other teams would be caught, while he executed a clean grab of the entire prize. It was intelligence bait, public theater, and a brutal personal heist, all in one. Our would-be dramatist, the boss who swore he'd bow out in spectacle, ended up with nothing. Officially, his entire shipment was gone. His fortune evaporated, and he vanished. To this day, no one knows where he is. The fake police chief? Equally mysterious. Some sources say he fled on a luxury yacht. Others claim the cargo was flown out by military aircraft. The whole affair is wrapped in shadow. As for the engineers who built the subs, those 12 specialists and their technicians, there are no happy endings. The boss wiped them out. None of them walked away from the experiment. It's grim and final. You might still wonder, if the subs showed almost no radar or electronic signature, how did Coast Guards find them? Remember, I said 33 nations were mobilized once intelligence smelled the operation. Patrols fanned out across local and regional waters. A semi-submersible that runs a fixed, predictable path can be intercepted if you know where to look. In short, coordinated, persistent search and classic interdiction tactics did what stealth alone could not. In the end, nearly everyone connected to the project was killed or disappeared, except the boss, the fake patrol chief, and a small number of their surviving associates. The rest, lost to the sea, to prison, or to the grave. There is a massive media blackout on the topic, and up until today, the only information we have is what I just told you. According to some sources, the leader's fame in the world of drugs surpasses even Pablo Escobar's, but officially, no one knows his real identity. In the end, had the operation truly succeeded, it would have involved smuggling a staggering 30 tons, an amount that could literally change the planet. To put the scale into perspective, It's like adding just a pinch of salt that can affect the entire dish. The same applies here with this quantity. That much contraband would have utterly destabilized global markets. Thank you for joining me for this fascinating and deeply mysterious story. If you're interested in more strange, unsolved, and technologically sophisticated true crime stories like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel or send me a message. I'm always ready to share more stories that will take you into worlds you never expected.